go through the very short introduction. So welcome to all attendees, and of course to the speakers of this session, which is entitled as the online brainstorming session on food security. What can the WTO do in times of crisis? So I'm sitting in for, of course, CEO of Friends of Multilateralism Group, Professor Shankun Liu. My name is Mia Mikic. I'm a member of the board. Liu is currently engaged in a session with IMF, and I hope he might join us later or not. We'll see. I'm pretty sure that you are familiar with the group and our activities. We have been in operation since 2016. And we are established as a think tank of independent experts that are firmly committed to promoting multilateralism and shared growth within the multilateral trading system. And I think further details of our previous activities and upcoming ones are available on the website. And the website is simply fmg-geneva.org. So as pointed out in our invitation to this session, at present, the world is confronted with multiple crises. And of course, the pandemic is not subsiding as we expected. And we are facing new crises, particularly the conflict in Ukraine, which has led to the sharp increase in food prices and worsening of food security, particularly in developing countries of Africa and Middle East. So this serious situation, of course, invited many meetings and consultations and seminars, including the one that was organized by the WTO recently. And they all highlighted very important role of trade in finding the solution to the crisis. The purpose of this session of the Friends of the Multilateralism Group is to really add to the discussion that is already existing and to go deeper into what WTO can do in addressing the challenges and provide solutions and into ensuring that smooth trade flow of food products and keep markets open for both exports and imports of such products will, if not eliminate, but at least somehow weaken the seriousness of the food security crisis. So before I hand over to the moderator, allow me to gently remind everyone to please mute yourself if you are not talking to reduce sound disturbances, as the session has been recorded for the later dissemination on our website. Let me now hand over to the moderator of today's session, that is Ahmad Mukhtar. He is senior economist and leading the policy team at the regional office of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, for Near East and North Africa, based in Cairo, Egypt. So he will be introducing the speakers of the session and moderating the session from now on. Ahmad, I hope you can take over, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mia, and a very good afternoon to all distinguished participants and colleagues, ex-colleagues or Geneva faces. Without further ado, I think we should get into the presentations. We would have 3 presentations today, or 3, let's say, ideas, followed by a discussion. So to start with, we all know that we have Professor Simon Evenett with us, who is Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen. And of course, he is a very well-known face and a founder of the Global Trade Alert, the Independent Commercial Policy Monitoring Initiative, which is located in the St. Gallen. So without, further details, because I think, Professor Simon, you do not need any introduction at all, the least in this group. We would request if you can kindly run us through, I understand you have a brief presentation that you have prepared on the recent export restrictions that we are seeing on the food and agriculture. So over to you, Professor Evenett.
Thank you very much. And indeed, my task here is to put some facts on the table. And I think those facts then raise a few questions which we may want to explore later. I have some slides and I'll raise them right now. I hope you can see them, and I will maximize them in presentation mode. Right. So my job is to put the export curbs on food and fertilizer in perspective so that you can begin to see how serious a problem this has become. Since the invasion of Ukraine, 72 different export controls on food and fertilizer products have been introduced worldwide by a total of 27 different nations. These 72 export controls do not include any of the export bans or sanctions which have been imposed by Western countries and Japan on the Russian Federation and Belarus. So this is 72 new measures. To give you a sense about how this adds to the stock of export controls, on the left-hand side, please look at the light brown line, which shows that since the beginning of this year, there has been a surge in the number of export controls, introduced up to now 147, which are in force. This chart on the left shows you the total number which is in force. So every time a measure lapses, this total falls. And so we can see that not since the beginning of the pandemic have we seen so many export controls in place. On the right-hand side, you can see the number of countries involved in the imposition of these export controls, and this number has risen to 56, and you can see that this is now higher than it has ever been since the pandemic began. Further context is provided by comparing across policy instruments, and perhaps the most important point is that many countries have resorted to liberalizing imports of food and fertilizer, and this has indeed happened since the invasion of Ukraine as well, with now 201 import reforms on food and fertilizer being in effect. The bad news is that a number of countries are also resorting to import restrictions for food and fertilizer, and these have been growing as well since the beginning of the year. So although export curbs have been used and controls have been used, please don't forget these other policy developments which we may want to think about in the context of a package of measures to help solve these matters. That's the first set of points. The second very important point I would like to put on the table is that there is significant regional variation in how countries are responding since the invasion of Ukraine. If you look in the sort of Eastern Europe CIS region, which is really captured on the left-hand chart, you can see that there is a considerable expansion in the number of export controls being used, and this is again the light brown line, but also the number of import curbs and import reforms is also rising. And interestingly, some countries have also been removing pre-existing export controls which had been in force. So we see a pattern of movement along all four dimensions, but of course the most prevalent being resort to export controls. Now, if you compare that to South Asia, in South Asia, with the important exception of this Indian wheat export ban that we saw, in fact, most of the action in South Asia is on import reforms or import curbs, and both of those have been rising. And so we do see quite important regional variation in the response to the export to the food price increases of more recent months, and this may well influence the official positions taken in Geneva by different countries. So please don't think that all of the world follows the pattern that you've heard about in the conflict zone or in regions like the Middle East and North Africa. So that's the second important point. The third point relates to duration of these export controls. And here we now have, since the beginning of the pandemic, enough data to be able to calculate average duration of export controls. And the median length of an export control in food and fertilizer is 90 days. There is huge variation between a maximum length of 480 days and a minimum length of 4 days. And in fact, many of the Russian export curbs and measures actually last for a week or two. They actually alter their export taxes, for example, almost on a weekly basis. And so we do have quite a lot of variation in resort to export measures. And I should say by export measures, I do mean export tax changes, export quota changes, as well as export bans. So there is quite a lot of variation in the length, but still 90 days does appear to be the median length. So that tells you that half of export controls last for less than 90 days. And this is a point I'll refer to later. Now, I haven't shown you any data on the amount of trade involved in these with these export curbs, but you may have read the very sort of interesting statistic which has been put out by IFPRI in Washington, where they've argued that the export curbs can cover 15 to 20% of the calories that are traded across borders in the form of food. So that gives you a sense of the scale of this. And of course, there's a lot of domestic production of food as well, which of course doesn't cross borders. So these are 3 sets of facts then on the resort, the differences across regions, and the length of food export controls and fertilizer export controls, which may be of interest. In my view, this raises 5 questions, which I'll briefly state. The first is that during the last global food price crisis, it was argued that the AMIS system did a great job in persuading governments that there was ample food and that there was no need to resort to or stick to export controls that they've put in place. This time round, of course, there are pronounced reductions in harvests. And so as a result, the same transparency may well have spread the fear that governments might not have enough food for their populations. This is not an argument against transparency. It's more, I think, an argument that qualifies its effects. And it's certainly an argument which suggests that transparency alone is probably not going to help us solve this problem. The second question I would put on the table is we see in the data clear domino effects. So one country's export controls on food being followed by others. And this suggests that the behavior of governments is influencing other governments' behavior. These are exactly the type of spillovers that we tend to worry about in the context of analyzing international cooperation or its absence. And so then the question is, to what extent should any revision of the rules on export controls at the WTO reflect the potential for domino effects? The third question I would put on the table is it appropriate to view each export control as equally bad? Is an export control by Lebanon as bad as an export control by China on wheat, for example? Or can objective measures be developed to identify export controls of systemic concern? And so maybe this is an area where objective metrics can be developed to help identify which countries' exports and which products are of greatest concern and where maybe WTO disciplines could apply. The fourth observation is that we do have in WTO rules time limits on departures from MFN treatment, and one wonders whether or not, given the data I've shown you on export controls, whether it would make sense to have maximum durations for the resort to export controls. And the last question to put on the table is, in thinking through what any new disciplines could be on export controls at the WTO with respect to food and fertilizer, should we also think about the other policy options that governments have, such as import reforms, and think about what packages of responses to global food price concerns and shortages might make sense? So should the discussion be focused on export controls or widened to encourage a resort to policies which facilitate trade in food? Let me conclude there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Evenett, for raising these pertinent questions, and I'm sure we'll have a discussion on that. You are right that last time around the MS worked, and this time it's the same AMIS, but in French. So if you have good MEs around the world, they would help you, otherwise no. So with that, you have already mentioned about the WTO negotiations. So why don't we hear what is happening around there, and who could be better than Evan Rogerson, who we all know, once again, FMG member, but he's a senior fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore and coordinator of the Singapore Trade Policy Forum. But he was in WTO until 2017, we all know. So I will not go into the details of his bio, Ivan. We know you. So without further ado, if you could request, if you can run us through what is happening or what is not happening in the WTO in this context. Over to you.
Unmute.
You're muted.
Okay, managed it. Sorry, I was just a bit technically challenged there for a minute. Thanks very much. I've been out of the WTO for 5 years now, so I'm uniquely well qualified to talk about what's going on there. And I mean, this, if I were, a very lazy man, I could do this very quickly by saying what's going on is not very much. But I mean, let's try and peel back a couple of the layers and see what could be happening. I mean, obviously, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, food security has shot to the top of the hit parade in the WTO negotiating context. But like so many things in the WTO, it means different things to different people. And the chances of getting a coherent, multilaterally agreed response are not improved by the fact that food security is understood in rather different ways across the membership. I mean, the chair recently at, I think it was the meeting they had a couple of weeks ago, the ag negotiating chair was quoted as saying that it's unimaginable for the WTO to fail to deliver on agriculture. I think she means at the very imminent ministerial. Well, I respect the chair has put in a lot of hard work and has really, given her all, but I would have to disagree. I don't think it's unimaginable at all for the WTO to fail to deliver on agriculture. Indeed, that has been pretty much the default setting. The first, and indeed so far the last negotiating success we've had in the last 20 years on agriculture was in 2015 on export subsidies. And it's been pretty dry since then. And the really depressing thing is that the problems that we were arguing about when I left in March 2017 are pretty much still the same problems. I could have dusted off, if I had any old briefing notes, I could have dusted them off and, it would have been much the same as it is today, which is not encouraging. So how does the WTO do something? How does it respond to the current food security challenge, crisis? Let's call it what you will. Well, there are two specific things on the table at the moment which have greater or lesser relevance. The first thing is a proposal which has been kicking around for quite a while now, which is to get an agreement that countries will not impose import restrictions on food supplies to the World Food Programme, which is, you would think a no-brainer, but we haven't been able to get agreement on that at the last, I think, 3 ministerials. It's coming up again for this one. You would think, surely to goodness, now is the time for people to say, let's do this very modest thing. It's simply ensuring that supplies for the poorest of the poor are maintained. And yet again, it seems to be difficult. And I don't know where we are on it at the moment. I know it's something that is high on the priority list for the ministerial, but as of right now, I wouldn't bet my own money on it being agreed. And one of the reasons that it's difficult, perhaps the main reason that it's difficult, is it has become tactically linked with another issue which also has some relevance to food security, depending on where you're coming from, greater or lesser relevance. and that's the famous issue of public stockholding for food security purposes, which of course is a bit of a misnomer because public stockholding per se is fine. It's part of the green box. It's not, there's no limits on it. What this really is about is public stockholding at administered prices, public stocks bought at administered prices. It's something not unlike the old infamous EU intervention system. So that's what it's about, buying public stocks at administered prices, and market price support was rightly, in my opinion, regarded as one of the big trade distorting policies that were disciplined by the Uruguay round. So that's it. It's public stockholding at administered prices, which is presented as a food security measure by its proponents, of whom the leading one is India. And they, as you know, we've had a long running series of negotiations on this. At the moment, we have a temporary solution agreed in 2013 in Bali, which keeps getting rolled over. And the proponents are very insistent there should be a permanent solution, and very much they have linked progress on other issues in agriculture, including the World Food Programme thing, to a permanent solution on public stockholding. At the moment, apparently, in Geneva, people are waiting, even though it's getting a bit late in the piece, for a promised new submission from the proponents, India and others, on the public stockholding issue for the ministerial. It's not going to leave a lot of time for it to be evaluated and discussed before the ministerial, but that's where we are. So the chances, I think, remain pretty high, sadly, that we could be heading for yet another one of these standoffs where linkages among issues, reflecting very entrenched differences among the members that have been there, you know, for years, where those entrenched differences prevent any substantive agreement at the ministerial. The other track that people are working on, and I think increasingly this is getting attention as the chances of substantive, meaningful results in a couple of weeks recede, is, you know, various work program ideas, and that's fine. Obviously, we have to keep working on subsidies, market access, etc. There is an urgent need, it seems to me, and not just to me, but to a lot of people, to update the negotiating approach. There's nothing wrong with the basic mandate from in Article 20 of the Agreement on Agriculture, but the way that it was fleshed out 20 plus years ago needs some revisiting. Since then, we've seen a lot of changes. Climate change has come to the fore as an issue. The sort of geographical politics of agriculture have changed a lot. Many more developing countries are now significant exporters as well. So the way in which we approach the continuing multilateral negotiations in agriculture, if they are to continue, and I'm still enough of an optimist to assume that people want them to continue, because trying to negotiate disciplines, for example, on agriculture subsidies, other than multilaterally, is pretty challenging. So maybe, and I would hope, and this takes us back to Simon's fourth point in that list of all very good points, and some of the things I hadn't thought enough about. So, you know, top marks, Simon, thanks. Your fourth point, I think, is absolutely on the money, that, you know, we desperately need to work on tightening up the existing rules on export restrictions in Article 11 of the GATT and in Article whatever it is of the AOA. I mean, these rules are pathetically weak, and I mean, I don't know how many of the 72 measures or whatever it is have been notified in advance. I have no idea. Some Doa or somebody may know. I suspect not many. I suspect there hasn't been much advanced consultation. I mean, these rules are they're best endeavors anyhow. They've got no teeth, and developing countries are totally exempted from them. They don't apply to developing countries. And that strikes me as a complete nonsense, given that now there are major developing country exporters. So those rules, which have been around one way or another, I guess, since about 1947, need looking at. And clearly the sort of ideas that Simon suggested there about looking at duration could well be part of that mix. Certainly, I think this whole current situation underlines the need to make a proper, holistic discussion of food security, not just some aspect of it that happens to suit some member and not others, but to look at it in the round, including focusing on the sadly rather few areas where WTO rules maybe can make a difference. And as I say, the rules on export prohibitions and restrictions come immediately to mind, but I very much take Simon's point that we need to look at the import side as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for a comprehensive view. And now let's take one more perspective from Bernard Hoekman, who is Professor and Director of Global Economics at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. We all know Bernard has been a known face in the World Bank. He was Director of the International Trade Department, and he has been an economist in the GATT days as well. And he has a very good analytical and deep eye on the trade issues. So Bernard, over to you for your perspective before we get into the discussions.
Okay, thanks. So if Evan has been away for 5 years, I have never been there in terms of actually doing and being involved in what I was asked to speak on. So I guess one of the reasons I've been asked to speak on the regular work is that we have been doing work thinking about WTO reform more generally. So I'll speak to some of that. So if we think about the regular work in the WTO on agriculture, on food security, we're talking about the Committee on Agriculture. And I think there the focus is very much on transparency, looking at implementation of the agreement, right? So it's very naturally, and I think very appropriately, focused on the agreement and implementation of the agreement, and not so much on kind of trying to figure out how do we deal with crises, how do we anticipate crises, what do we do in a situation like we are in now? And I would very much echo what Evan was just saying and what Simon has said in terms of we really need to think about, how do we deal with these episodes when there are sudden shocks? And I think one of the things, I think the regular work is there for, it's really there to do that, right? In principle, you can use it for that. And I think one of the questions I would ask then is to what extent that is happening or not. And I think here I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I'm not part and embedded in the machinery. But I think that's one of the questions I would pose. Now, if you look at some of the work that has been done in the project I've been involved in that looks at dimensions of WTO reform, there's two elements here in terms of regular work that are emphasized. And this is all based on work that was done by Robert Wolf at Queen's University. So one of them is the extent to which the committees, in this case would be the Agricultural Committee, deals with what in the TBT SPS context is called specific trade concerns. Right now, it's not called that in the agricultural context, but it's kind of equivalent. And I think here, there's a mechanism at least to kind of raise issues associated with what is going on right now. And I think one of the questions I would again put forward, to which I don't know the answer, is to what extent is the committee actually being used to deal with the concerns of net food importing countries and kind of thinking about, okay, so what can we do in a cooperative manner to address the situation we're in, which is clearly an exogenous shock, right? So we have a war situation in Ukraine with Russia having invaded Ukraine, which is giving rise to shortages, not just of food, but also the stuff we need to produce food. So think of fertilizers in particular, but also there's a dimension here with respect to vegetable oils also becoming more in short supply. So I think there is a mechanism there to have this type of discussion. I know that the WTO has been hosting what are called thematic sessions, right? So in a sense, mechanisms, workshops, seminars where you actually bring in other organizations that have expertise and a mandate to work on the agricultural area. And of course, the FAO is front and center in this. So I think that's all good. But I think what I would suspect is missing, and again, this is a question, but I think what would be useful in terms of regular work is, to what extent does this get internalized in the discussions of the committee? To what extent do WTO members actually take this information that is there, information which is provided by the Agricultural Monitoring Information System, information and analysis that is provided by IFPRI, the studies and blogs that Simon mentioned, which are extremely informative, and these are people who are really deeply, have deep expertise in agriculture and agriculture market. Is that used? Is there an effort to say, okay, here's what's out there, how do we then deal with the problem? What can we do collectively? And I think this problem-solving approach, which is something that kind of is advocated in some of these WTO reform studies, is something that seems to be missing. So that's one point I would make. I think another point I would make, and this also ties in a bit with the responses to the COVID pandemic, is on the one hand, you need to understand and give policymakers tools for understanding what's actually going on in markets. To what extent are there substitution possibilities? Where are there demand supply imbalances? What's happening in global value chains that are frictional in nature and that could potentially be alleviated? And I think here, going back to what Evan was also talking about in terms of looking forward as to what type of frameworks you might think about putting in place that support cooperation in times of external shocks and crises, it's kind of thinking about what could you do, what should you do? And I think here the focus, I think it would be great if there could be agreement on rules. I don't really see that as being very likely because governments respond to immediate pressures. But I think what is important is to do much more in the way of analysis, right? So yes, we have countries putting in place export restrictions. Are those things actually effective, right? And what are the spillover effects of these types of restrictions? And I think just putting that information out there and having that discussed in regular meetings of the appropriate WTO bodies might actually help kind of create a common basis of information and understanding for actually how we could deal with this collectively. Now, one of the things that has been suggested by the IFPRI agricultural economist, just as an example, is, why in the world are we still supporting the use of crops to create biofuels and to put that in our tank? Right? When that stuff, the original source material is actually things that can and should be used for consumption, right? To deal with hunger. So mice is a good example, but also in the area of vegetable oils, right? So there's one very concrete proposal. It's something that could be brought forward in discussions as part of the regular work and say, okay, let's see what we can do on that. Now, that doesn't mean we throw away our climate commitments. We don't stop worrying about greenhouse gas emissions, etc. But this, in the context of a crisis, what are the margins on which you can adjust? And I think you need to have a discussion among the relevant countries to think about how you do that. Also, thinking about lessons we learned or should have learned in the context of the current pandemic. Are there opportunities to actually shut down speculation? Where there's joint action to think about, how can you reduce the incentives that traders naturally have to either hoard, to sell at market prices, which is the natural incentive. But insofar as there is speculation in these markets, there's something that can be done on that front. Is there scope for joint procurement? Right now, obviously, that's something that's done by the World Food Program. But again, thinking about how you could do a better job at cooperating to actually generate the resources to actually buy stocks that exist is something, again, that could be part of the regular work. So again, I think for me, it's mostly a question to the people who are on this call who actually are involved in this process. Does this happen, and to what extent is there this channel between what is going on out there in terms of analysis, in terms of data provision, and discussions in the WTO context to actually think about this through a problem-solving type lens. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bernard. So in order to sum up all of that, we have an excellent discussant with us, Dua Abdel Mutal. We all know she's Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and she has been an expert on the environment, climate change, and agriculture for a long time. And Dua was also, as we know, was Deputy Chief of Staff during Pascal Lamy's time and the peak time when we had the negotiations. And she's back to the WTO. She had spent some time in IFAD and some other interesting ventures as well. So without further ado, Dua, over to you for your comments as discussant.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and hello to you all. This group is called the Friends of Multilateralism, but I think just the word friends would be enough given how many friends I see on this screen, and it really is heartwarming to see so many of you here, so many people that I haven't seen in a really long time, so it's lovely to reconnect. I hadn't prepared a presentation for this meeting, given that I'm the discussant, so I was waiting to hear the various presentations. And I think we heard 3 excellent presentations by Simon, Evan, and Bernard on export restrictions, the negotiations, and the regular work. So I guess as discussant, my role is to provoke discussion. So I'll just put some broad thoughts on the table, which Ahmed, you can then use as you moderate. I guess my first comment is that we have to remember that when we created the Agreement on Agriculture, or when the world created the Agreement on Agriculture, it did that against a background of very low food prices. And the goal during those very low food price years was to reduce subsidies. Subsidies was an overwhelming concern, in particular export subsidies, countries pushing low-priced food onto international markets with the aid of those subsidies. And of course, the world has changed since then. We've had the 2008 food price crisis where food prices rose significantly. And we now have the current situation we're in, which is due to COVID and now due to the conflict and so on. And we have even higher food prices. And of course, the trade policy concerns that arise when food prices are high are completely different from those that arise when food prices are low. Now, suddenly, we're all concerned about countries hoarding their food because the price is high, wanting to no longer share with their neighbor. So the concern is completely the opposite. To some extent, the Agreement on Agriculture has served us well for low price years in the sense that we have cut subsidies and we've completely eliminated export subsidies. It is serving us less well in high food price years. And this is the problem we need to sort of, to get to and to figure out. This is the problem we must now resolve. How can this agreement shift focus to this new reality? Before it shifts focus, however, it will have to address, in my opinion, the fact that because it was created in low food price years, it locked in a food price base period based on 1986-88. And that's not a small or inconsequential problem. And it's something that never comes up in the agriculture negotiations, which is kind of hilarious because it is the elephant in the room, as far as I can see, because the 1986-88 base period locks in subsidy rates based on those very low food price years. So any subsidy you give today automatically becomes a big subsidy because you're comparing to 86-88. So it's created an issue, I would say, in the Agreement on Agriculture, which the developing world sees as a systemic inequity. The new subsidizers don't understand why they have to why they have to be abiding by a base period that no longer reflects reality. But those that won that base period, the very strong food exporting countries don't want to touch it because it's an instrument for them to keep subsidies as low as possible. So we have this structural problem in the AOA that we need to deal with as we start to shift focus from a low price food background situation to a high price food world. Now, when, so the agreement in general serves us less well when prices are high, and it serves us less well when we're faced with emergencies. And those emerge in an emergency by definition, whether COVID or now, an emergency by definition is high prices. And so we are immediately faced, whether in COVID or now with the war, with a hoarding of food, countries wanting to look inwards. Now, I would say that, the hoarding of food and that desire to not share is more problematic in today's world than it was before when we created the agreement because of global value chains. So it used to be that protectionism was there to protect, a country would become protectionist to protect its producers. At the expense of consumers, at the expense of its consumers. I think it's now the case because of global value chains that when you impose protectionist measures, you are also hurting some of your producers. So, I always take the bar of chocolate example because I live in Switzerland and it's the simplest example. So bar of chocolate, which, says made in Switzerland, Lindt, for example, is actually not made in Switzerland at all. It's assembled in Switzerland. The milk will come from Germany, the Netherlands, New Zealand. The sugar will come from Brazil. The chocolate will come from Ghana. The nuts and the flavors will come from other parts of the world. Switzerland assembles all of that into a Lindt and it's made in Switzerland, but it is no longer the case that our food is made anywhere. It's assembled just like a car and a washing machine. So, not dealing with the problem of export restrictions is more problematic given today's value chains. And I wonder, of course, whether the problem that we're in means that countries, because they are not served so well by the agreement on agriculture in high food price years and in global emergencies, whether coalitions of like-minded will begin to trade together based on regional agreements or whatever other agreements outside of the WTO that allows countries with shared values to share goods as well and services. So the more values you share, the more you're able to share goods and services, and the more you know that in an emergency, your friend and neighbor will not abandon you. And that's, of course, a very risky situation, but I think it's part of the sort of global reorganization of trade that we're seeing. And I think we need to be cautious of that and to not let that get out of hand without fixing the multilateral trading system. Finally, I just wanted to make a general comment on, given that we've had a presentation on the negotiations and one on the COA, I think the WTO has a major marketing problem. And perhaps the problem is more than marketing. It's a genuine inability to understand its own value. I think the organization truly does not understand its own value. So, I joined the agriculture division in 2019, and I was told by everyone, you will see there's nothing happening in the negotiations. Until a colleague of mine dragged me into what is called the Committee on Agriculture, quote unquote, regular work. And he said, Doa, you'll see what happens here. And right he was. What we call regular work in the WTO, and it's a very bureaucratic name and label to be sticking on what is the bulk of the WTO, is astonishing in its importance, in its level of detail, in its significance, in the amount of dispute resolution that it leads to preemptively. It's the nuts and bolts of international trade. If any of you follow the COA or have ever just seen the agenda of a COA meeting, It's encyclopedic. It's everything that is happening in a specific time period that is bogging down trade. It's all the bottlenecks. They get put on the table, the concerns are raised, responses are given, they're sent back to capital, more responses are given in subsequent meetings. And I think if the WTO were the COA alone on agriculture, that would be enough to make the organization hugely valuable. But of course, we just call that bureaucratically regular work, which is incredible. Then, we have a tendency to say that we have achieved nothing since the agreement on agriculture. And of course, that's because we look at agriculture through the negotiations prism, and looked at through that prism, that might be the case. But we have negotiated a trade facilitation agreement, which is saving food perishables at the border every day. The amount of food that was being wasted at borders every day because of slow customs procedures, food rotting in containers, and we need to start costing all of that, but evidence is beginning to emerge on the amount of food we are actually saving. It goes even beyond the value of trade. It's the value of food that is being saved through this agreement. We've also just concluded an agreement on services domestic regulation. And how many countries are unable to trade in food because they don't have the services to move the food or to market the food or to retail the food? So I think looked at through the narrow prism of the Committee on Agriculture special session, yes, we're failing, we're not making progress, but looked at through the WTO rulebook as a whole, what a contribution we're making. I also find that, there's a tendency in the WTO to focus the negotiations on issues that auto-resolve. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we eliminated food export subsidies when the world stopped subsidizing food exports. We didn't eliminate them because the WTO decided. We followed based on what countries were doing, and we consolidated that into a rule. And I think much will happen with a lot of other issues. So we keep on talking about water and tariffs, water and subsidies, which is all the gap that countries have between what they've committed to in the WTO and the rates that they actually apply. And that gap is enormous. And that's because issues are auto-resolving, because countries understand the value of trade and they are liberalizing. But we keep on shining the light on the issues that are fixing themselves in the WTO and not focusing on the issues that might not fix themselves or on the value of what we actually do to fix things that need fixing. And I'll stop here, but I really think that a WTO reform agenda is about bringing some people into a room and agreeing on what the real value is of what the WTO does, because I think we may have actually forgotten it. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Doha. Thank you for reminding us that how do we do, if at all, anything in the WTO negotiations. Okay, so we have four excellent interventions from different colleagues. I think now we are all set for a very lively discussion. We have about 40 minutes on our hand. So since we have a virtual floor, I don't know how do we want to go, but if you can kindly raise your virtual hand, and then we can have a discussion whether these are questions or comments or your own views on that one. So with that, who would take the first try? Okay, Ambassador Alan Wolf, over to you, sir.
Well, thanks to FMG for sponsoring this fantastic discussion, and for those who have intervened, who are really great. There is Doha's last intervention is important, that there's a value in the WTO that we pass by on the way to looking at the where it hasn't produced. I look at the food security problem in the prism of the pandemic response of the WTO, namely none. 2.5 years later, an argument about whether anything at all could be agreed whatsoever. Yeah, and I look back at among my first visits to the WTO were in 1971. The U.S. had put on an import surcharge. It appalled the world. with 10% import surcharge on all imports, exempting duty-free imports. So it didn't hit the developing countries that mainly exporting commodities at the time. Met in continuous session day after day after day after day throughout August of last half of August in 1971 to condemn the United States. Ultimately, since it was an exchange rate problem, it got resolved with the Smithsonian 4 months later. But the fact is, no one was going to let it go, and it was a working party, not a panel. It was very easy to condemn the United States because at the time, balance of payments could not be met with a tariff. It could only be met with a quota. So the U.S. had no defense other than it could have done something worse, which was its defense. What do the words equitable share mean in Article 20, the guarantee an equitable share? Even the auto group could not address that issue, would not put on the table anything on the subject. Those words must mean something, and they're not defined at all. I've come from a country that has lost its ability to do anything. So it's not, it's sort of similar to the negotiating functions of the WTO. We just had another massacre of school children in the United States. We will not do anything about it, I suspect, unable to respond. Similarly, the WTO, there's a pandemic, can't do anything about it 2.5 years later. Now the food security. Why isn't there an emergency meeting called by the Director General who says, we're all going to sit here until we figure out some things we can do. We call in Simon and Bernard and Evan and talk to Doha about what might be put on the table, and we try to do something about it. We put more information on the table. We're going to try to address these issues. We'll have longer term issues to address, but in the short term, we have convening power. We're going to do something. I think there are things that could be done immediately. They might all not be done by the WTO. Opening up the Black Sea is going to be something that's sort of a military and geopolitical issue. But it's all tackled in other forums. It's a trade issue very heavily. So why aren't the trade people talking about what can be done? I'm just speaking out of frustration with the WTO. Forget about MC12. It ought to be in session now. There should have been an emergency meeting of trade ministers. Anyway, those my 2 cents, which is largely just venting.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wolf. With that, we go to Sherry-Stephenson. Sherry, over to you.
Thank you very much, moderator, and thank you very much to all the speakers and the commentator. I thought it's been really an interesting and very thought-provoking sessions and series of questions put on the table, so I just have a couple of my own. This is not my area of specialization, so I'm thinking about it a little bit, from maybe a fresh point of view or maybe a naive point of view. I'm not sure, one of the two. But I thought that Doha's putting this into context as the problem presently is looking at the agreement on agriculture in the current situation, not in a context of, low food prices and the problem being export subsidies, but high food prices and the problem being export controls. So in that context, I guess my question is, and of course linked to food security concerns, my question would be, why are there no quote unquote champions that have appeared in the WTO in the last 2 years that have put this issue first, forward on the table, knowing its importance, why maybe there are, and I just don't know, why has this not been a concern of the Ottawa group? Why has there been no attempt to look at the question that Simon raised, I think is very legitimate, as is each export control equally bad, or can we develop objective metrics to identify export controls that would be a systemic concern as opposed to export controls that might be, of limited duration and not very impactful? Does this necessarily and absolutely have to be linked to food security because it is a question that has arisen in the time of the pandemic, or is it a question that would have arisen in any context of higher food prices and therefore needs to be looked at no matter what? I guess these are a little bit, my concerns, and I fully share Alan's frustration about the fact that the WTO needs to be seen as doing something to respond to the pandemic, both in the area of trade and health, but also in the area of agriculture and export controls, and link it or not to food security. Anyway, 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry, for this specific question. I think if you allow our colleagues, this was, I think, more or less to Dua, but other panelists could also respond. We can take 2 more interventions, and then maybe we might have more questions or comments. So with that, Victor Duprado, over to you, Victor.
Thank you very much, Ahmad. Thank you to the group for hosting this very interesting discussion. Thanks to the 3 presenters, always very enlightening. We learn a lot. So thanks for that. I remember the World Food Program proposal put by Singapore. How many times has that become a frustration? But we know how many countries blocked, and we know who they are. So it is a frustration, but then what to do? I guess the WTO continues to be ill-prepared to deal with emergency situations. The rule book has been there for over 25 years now, and that's what we have. Now, there are countries, of course, that want to be more cooperative, that want to do something. But at the same time, there are also frustrations. I hear now from my fellow Brazilians that they don't want the WTO disciplines on agriculture to go backwards, because that seems to be a response to a current situation. And going to Doa's point, historically, are the prices of food high or low? Because the WTO is going to be, again, ill-prepared to deal with a current situation. But in terms of the long term, what is the price of food like? Or commodities? Is it high or is it low? The Brazilians would be saying, listen, they are rather historically low. And if you start, tempering with the rules to respond to situations that are conjunctural rather than structural, then we might be in a slippery slope. So again, the question is, what do we do for emergency, and how do you correct that for the future? Yeah, it is. Everybody, I guess, shares the frustration, but is subsidies at this time the best response? Is public stockholding for food security in an unregulated and undisciplined manner the response these days? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. Let us take one more intervention from Ambassador Ahmad Gamaluddin from Egypt, and let's see what member states are thinking at this point in time. So over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmad, and I really benefited a lot from the presentations and the discussant today, and those who made questions. As I see many of those who spoke afterwards were saying the 2 cents worth. So let me give my 2 cents worth of discussion. Number one, we are in front of an emergency situation. And I guess there is no doubt that there is an emergency right now. Do we deal with the emergency situation with normal policy tools, or do we try to provide policy tools that are suitable to deal with the emergency? That is a big question. There is a regular program of work of the Committee on Agriculture, which has been going on for a long time. This is a separate matter. Now we are talking about the situation of the food crisis, and we see in various organizations a lot of meetings related to the food security, starting from the Security Council, which was where the United States has organized this area formula meeting to discuss food security, to the FAO, to the Bretton Woods, to the WTO. Are we in front of a situation where there is a problem of supply or not? I happen to have had the pleasure of attending a global round table of international grain exporting and trading associations. And they were saying that they don't see that there is a problem of supply. However, they agree that there is a problem of prices that do not make any sense. Even before the war between Russia and Ukraine has started, the prices had gone up in the beginning of the year to $338. Now they are over $500. Assuming that half of the production of Ukraine were to be destroyed by the war, that impacts 7% of the production only. Is the current price justified? Some people tell you, well, the work of the market and the prices, and we do not intervene. In the case of a country like Egypt, we do consume 22 million tons per year, and we produce about 9.5. The difference we import, and actually 80% of which comes from Russia and Ukraine. How can countries in this situation deal with prices that go up that much? And we are within the same cropping season. We have not yet seen the impact of lack of fertilizers, the impact of the war itself, etc. Why is there the justification of the prices going up by so much? That has always puzzled many of us, and we want to see that there would be an emergency meeting to discuss these issues. And I agree with Mr. Hoekman when he says that this is an exogenous shock. We are talking about the situation of a certain group of countries who are called net food developing importing countries. That category was set up, was included in the agreement in 1994. And until today, there has not been any program of work to operationalize and provide this group of countries whose membership is increasing rather than reducing with the necessary policy tools. So I guess that we need to think rationally and to think collectively and to try to solve the urgent problems with urgent means. And just to remind that at the end of the day, the WTO is a member-driven organization. So it takes the political will of the various protagonists to deal with this issue. And at this stage, even in the case of food, I am told, and I'm not a specialist in this area, that production, not trade, is the vast majority of global food consumption. That is, what is being traded is only 14 or 15%. So we have to look at the value chains. We have to look at the problems of the structural problems that inhabit and how to increase food security of the countries and the subsistence farmers to be helped, etc., and rural development. I am sorry I talked long, but I just wanted to give, as I told you in the beginning, my 2 cents worth of a non-specialized person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. In fact, you have given me a little bit of margin to say the FAO words as well that you have already said, because trade is certainly just one part. Of course, we understand and we agree with you that the rising food prices have been an issue, and this, of course, this predates the Black Sea crisis or the Ukraine crisis. So we have to focus on that. And we also know that the fiscal spaces of many of the governments are shrinking, and the governments, particularly in the region that, Ambassador, you come from or where we are located, governments are really being stretched out in terms of the subsidies and supports on the basic food supplies. I mean, we are not talking about the farming subsidies. So situation is much more than let's say a subset of things that we are discussing in the WTO when it comes to the food security. So if panelists kindly allow, we have one more intervention from Republic of Korea, Minister Councillor Jeong, and then I think we'll go back to the panelists for a round of their comments. So over to you, Mr. Jeong.
Thank you very much. I am Il Jung from Korean Mission to WTO. Thank you very much, the WTO colleagues and the ambassador, Egyptian ambassador, for your wonderful remarks. In WTO, we had several food crisis seminar, and I observe it looks like that current crisis has two stages. The first stage is the current food crisis because of the blockade in the Black Sea. 25 million metric ton of the grains of the Ukraine are stocked in the Odessa port. This blockade make a lot of food shortage problem in Middle East countries and also WFP. I think that the current shortage of food in the WFP is very serious. Like the DG of the WFP, David Beasley, visited the first week of May into Odessa, and it looks like that because of the food shortage, they are lessening the ration to the Yemen, like 8 million people, to 50% now, and then they should decrease to 0% in several months. So it is very, very serious problem for them. So I think that anyway, this would not be solved by the WTO. We can ask to resolve the blockade, but probably political decision, like among the head of states or the foreign ministers among big countries should resolve this issue. That is very imminent problem issue we should solve in short term. Another big like the food crisis is probably next year. We saw that the planting season has already gone for the Ukraine, the wheat and the corn, and so around 10% of grains would disappear in the world market next year. And also because of the increase of the fertilizer prices and the energy prices, what I heard is that the production in the world would be decreased. Some like organization estimate that in Africa, because of the increase of fertilizer price, this year's their grain production would decrease one third of them gone. So for me, it looks like that there would be real food shortages in the next year. But when we have like the seminar in WTO, some experts, also some like statistics which was presented by the International Grain Council, actually they show that the food is enough. So like logically it looks like to be very short, but some experts said that we have still enough food. So it makes a very confusing signal to us and also to the policymakers and the farmers. So I would like to know somebody can answer about that. Anyway, any expert, every expert said that anyway we will have the stock would be decreased from this year to next year. So probably it will push up the price, but they told that we have still enough food in the world. So actually, I don't know if we are really shortage in the food, probably we should give a very big signal to the farmers. For example, next year, the price of the wheat will go up. So for example, the EU countries should utilize the current set aside land, which they do not cultivate. But this year it is necessary to like the plant in those set aside land to produce more. So probably the making of the the correct estimate for the next year's like food situation would be very, I think that would be very important part. Thank you.
Kamsahamnida Jiangxi. In fact, in the MS and other FAO and OECD related work, we do have some projections. And I'll try, I think we have a colleague here, Guy Roule from our Geneva office. Guy, if you can kindly check with the GEO's colleagues in the HQ and send some of those numbers to Mr. Jeong. So with that, we'll go back to panel. I think there were some specific questions. Dua, you had a specific question as well from Sherry. And the other panelists, if you can kindly comment or share your further reflections on what we had as a discussion from the participants.
Thank you, Ahmed, for that. To Sherry's question, who are the champions? So in general, the champions on the issue of food export restrictions are the net food importing countries, the countries that can't survive without trade. So for example, you have a country like Saudi Arabia that imports almost 90% of its food. You go to another continent, you move to Asia, Singapore imports 80% of its food. You move to another continent, Haiti imports 30 to 40% of its food. So, so there are countries that really can't make it without trade in food. And those are the champions of this issue in the WTO. Sometimes they don't champion it as much as they should, even if it really should be their issue. I think there are a lot of net food importers that are not vocal enough. I think the problem is that in an emergency situation, a politician responds quickly in a way that pleases his or her constituency. So the response is based on a political timescale and is not based on considerations of, the health of the multilateral trading system or, the well-being of the WTO or all of that. So how do we break that cycle? I think it's very difficult, but I think we need to think of innovative solutions like commercial arbitration. There's a lot of commercial arbitration that's been taking place in the past few weeks over contracts that haven't been respected. The WTO doesn't do commercial arbitration. Should we? Should that be something that we do? So I think, we need to just think of ways in which we can intervene that go beyond perhaps just rulemaking. In terms of, the comment that was made comments made by Egypt and Korea on food prices, I think what's happened is that, the Black Sea region is the world's cheapest breadbasket. So a ton of wheat, a ton of European wheat is, and I have the figures somewhere, a ton of European wheat is significantly more expensive. Yes, $25 to $30 per ton extra relative to the Black Sea region. So what has been taken out of the world is the cheapest breadbasket. And so by definition, getting the food from elsewhere is more costly and it has to travel, wheat from elsewhere has to travel longer distances. So right now we are in the middle of a food price crisis because markets are reorganizing, but the real food shortage is next year because of the fertilizer shortage, because of the planting seasons that are being affected, et cetera. So next year might actually be worse.
Thank you, Dua. The other panelists, Simon, Evan, Bernard. Simon, please.
Thank you. I mean, perhaps I can pick up on an example that Dua just gave. I think it's a slightly different approach to take, not just looking for legal mechanisms, which could be useful. I mean, we ought to look at some of the experience of the last few weeks. We had Indonesia, that I believe the world's largest exporter of palm oil, putting a ban in for the domestic political reasons that Dua said, and then reversing it 3 weeks later because it backfired. Now, this is not necessarily a trade policy question directly, but surely there ought to be some understanding as to why this policy was reversed and whether it was a smart thing to do in the first place. And if there is if there's a rule book for how you handle, or at least a sensible rule book, playbook, let's call it a playbook, not a rule book, a sensible playbook for how countries facing food price increases should respond, we might find that resort to trade measures is actually not what we want to do. So I think there's actually a lot from the sort of analysis side which could actually inform these decisions which governments make. And it might point to politicians that the sort of instinctive, reflexive political economy, which apparently has been internalized in Geneva and epitomized by Doha's comments, might not actually be so smart overall. And maybe we can learn from these last few weeks and months to see how we can come up with better responses which don't require trade policy initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Any other panelist or participants wishes to? One, please. So you're muted.
Unmute, yeah. Thanks. Just very briefly on a couple of things. Emotionally, I guess I'm coming from a similar place as Alan and Victor, which is the frustration end of town. I mean, while I appreciate Doha's heroic attempts to look on the bright side, the fact remains that if we look at the negotiations, which is what I was asked to talk about, the prospect is not a very bright one. Now, what can we do about that? I honestly do not think that repeating the same pattern of behavior that we've been trying and failing at for the last 20 odd years is going to do it. We're bashing our head against a brick wall again and again, and it's the same brick wall. And you'd think eventually we'd learn. I do think the negotiations, if they are going to be pursued, and as I say, I'm still optimistic enough to think they're worth pursuing, but they do need a serious injection of new intellectual and political adrenaline. I agree very much with Bernard that we need more information. Well, like everyone's been saying, we need more information. We need to know, as Simon said, what these policies are actually doing. Are we actually, when we negotiate, are we negotiating about the right things anymore? Some of the things we're talking about in the negotiation may not actually be, the most important things to be talking about. I mean, the fact that we're kind of at the moment in the ag negotiations, there is practically nothing about the whole climate change nexus and agriculture, and that's pretty appalling. I don't share Doha's view about the agreement on agriculture. It wasn't particularly aimed at any price level. It's not. It doesn't relate to any particular level of prices. It relates to trade distortion, and that is as true now as it was then. And trade distortions operate in many different ways. They operate through imports, they operate through exports, they operate through technical barriers, they can operate in all kinds of ways. And the purpose of the agreement on agriculture, which I'm convinced remains valid, is to combat trade distortions. And I certainly agree with Victor and his Brazilian friends that the last thing we want to do is start unwinding that agreement. It wasn't there to respond to any particular price situation. It certainly wasn't just about export subsidies. It's about trade distortions. And that's as true now as it was then, and we're still suffering from trade distortions. That's why we're having this meeting. I think that it would be very useful if negotiators, maybe they should take a break for a bit, I don't know, but I think they need help from outside. I think they have got themselves trapped like hamsters going round a wheel, endlessly going round this wheel in the same direction and getting nowhere. And I think it probably is necessary for a lot of sort of intellectual ferment discussions like this and elsewhere. And I know there is work going on in places like IFPRI and elsewhere. And there's some excellent people there. And I think, I would agree with Alan that some excellent people more, and I can think of people much more suited than I am, for example, people like Joe Glauber, for example, to actually, be locked in a room with Simon and one or two others and and told to think up some new innovative ways of dealing with our mandate to reduce trade distortions. It doesn't mean governments are going to buy them immediately, but you got to start somewhere. And at the moment, we're getting nowhere. And I think this whole negotiating, the one thing that this food security crisis tells us is that, as Alan said, the WTO at the moment doesn't have an answer. It's actually not doing anything very much to help, like it didn't with the pandemic. And so you either decide the WTO is useless, which I'm not prepared to do yet, not while they're still paying my pension. And I think we must try and do it better. And that's all kinds of options. So when we talk about WTO reform, we're not just talking about dispute settlement or this, that, or the other. We are also talking about making the negotiating vocation of the WTO work better. And it certainly does need that kind of attention. And, I think you're only going to get that from some serious thinking outside the Geneva hamster wheel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. I think that has triggered some response from Doha. Over to you, Doha.
Just very briefly to say that, I'm by no means suggesting that we unwind the AOA. That wasn't in any way the intention of my comments. The intention of my comments was to say that the agreement on agriculture was negotiated against a background of low food prices, which got captured in the base period that was locked into the agreement. And that's the base period against which subsidies are measured in the WTO until today. And that's a fact. Today, food prices have risen significantly, and according to the FAO, high food prices are here to stay. So there is a new background reality. So I think those are facts. And I think this is why the focus is shifting to the issue of food export restrictions. Those restrictions are happening because of high food prices. So it's a shift in the focus of trade policy, really. I think we're likely to see, in some instances, lower subsidies, and in some instances, more hoarding of food going forward as a result of that background. So I think it's just in terms of understanding and contextualizing the trade policy instruments we're looking at. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doha. I think this could be probably the last comment because we have Shankun Lu joining us as well, who would like to say probably a few things in the end. But with that, over to you, Bernard, please.
Thanks. So just a few thoughts on what's been said. So I think, I'm certainly with with Alan and others who are frustrated. Let's put it that way. But I think also, just to defend some of the things Doha said, I think, and to go against, I guess, Evan, etc. So there are things going on inside the WTO, inside these committees, that really are not understood. And I think there is a PR dimension to that. But I think the point is you could build on that if there is will, if there is leadership. And I think my question was, to what extent is all the work and all the knowledge that is out there in terms of both the actual market situation and also policy, to what extent is that actually being brought forward, on the table there? And if that is not the case, then I think you really have a serious problem. And I have no idea whether that is or not. So Doha seems to be very positive that, yes, there's a lot going on. Others are clearly skeptical. But I think the opportunity is there. That's one. I think second, what I would say is the problem is not so much lack of leadership. The problem is the consensus constraint. Right? It's the working practice. It's the mode of operation. So I think insofar as I see any scope for doing the type of things that Alan would like to see the WTO Director General and the WTO membership collectively do, which is clearly not going to happen because it hasn't happened, we're going to have to move towards a plurilateral type of framework, right? And I think then the question becomes, what is the value of the WTO insofar as you have countries that want to do this? And is that better done somewhere else? Right? I think that's very much a question. I don't have an answer to it, but it seems to me that's the only way we're going to make progress in terms of actually dealing with crises, right? So I think it's also important to differentiate responses to exogenous shocks, crises that are of a global nature and that have huge spillover effects, like what we're seeing right now, where, if you have enough countries that can actually get their act together, cooperate and do something, we should definitely do whatever we can do to encourage that to happen without getting bogged down into the wheel that Evan was describing, which is clearly by definition and by design, not going to get you anywhere. So I think that's really where I would end up with in terms of doing that. And I think the question then becomes, where is that likely to happen? How can you put that together? And I think that really is a question of leadership, right? So we need to have countries actually step forward and say, let's think about creative solutions, which can come out of a process where we lock people into a room. But in terms of implementation and have a pre-commitment, ex ante, say, okay, we will do what we can once we agree on these particular proposals to move forward on them, right? And that could be public-private partnerships. I think the other thing we need to really kind of get away from is to think about this as all state to state, right? A lot of the solutions can and will come from the private sector. They also know where the frictions are. They know what can be done. So I think we need to do more to actually use that avenue as well, which again is completely missing from the WTO framework because they're not there. Thanks.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much, Bernard. Since we have just 3 minutes, may I request Sean Kun-Lu to say some words or probably even close the session, unless we are going a little bit further than 4:30, that was the allocated time.
Sorry, I think it is best Mia does it because I've been missing most part of the discussion, and I know that FMG sessions are always better without me. So I give it back to the able hands of Mia. Thank you.
Okay,
thank
excellent.
you very
so back
much.
To Mia.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lou. No, the sessions are always better with you, I think. But thank you for the opportunity to say a few words at the end. First of all, of course, thanking the moderator and the speakers for wonderful contributions, and discussants to be adding to the quality of the discussions we have heard. And I think in closing, I would like to say that what we heard only provides another layer of justification and rationale for the existence of this group, because there are at least 3 different ways in which the group can contribute further, which is promoting the discussion on better understanding of not only the measures that we have, but also how we can use this better analytical instrumentarium that we can put in place to come up not only with smarter instruments that will be more effective and targeting the objectives more pointedly, but also looking in different areas of decision making, and in particular what Bernard was saying now with public-private things. We also heard that WTO is not fit for purpose, and we have been hearing that for a long time. It first was declared not fit for purpose for long-term developmental goals. Now we hear that it's not fit for purpose to deal with crisis. And so something is in there that is making it not being responsive to the challenges. And I think what we heard lastly is probably decision-making that we are grappling with. And then also we heard about the need to build up this awareness of the benefits, right? If we used to say, if WTO did not exist, we should be putting it and establishing it, right? Are we still saying that? I think we are. And I think collectively we can actually add to building awareness of the benefits of having this platform to build and improve multilateral solution to whether there are short-term or long-term problems in the world. So with this, really thank you for the opportunity to discuss this very important topic. As we heard, it's gonna remain with us. It's gonna probably be worse next year before hopefully it gets better. But together we can work towards perhaps minimizing the impacts of those and finding solutions for the next situations that we will be encountering similar to this. So we will be letting you know about our next activities. As we know, the ministerial conference is coming shortly, and we will definitely be responding to some of the activities and events during that time. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you, Mia. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.